Thank you. Are we just about ready to sit down and listen to a wonderful presentation here? Looks like we're just about there. Oh, that'll help. Thank you. Our speaker this evening represents a generation which is recognized as one of the noblest, most deeply and unselfishly dedicated generations to the maintaining of the preservation of our freedom and that of the world. Now, our speaker, Tom Griffin, this evening exemplifies that generation. Tom was born in 1917 in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he entered the service of our country in 1939 as second lieutenant of the Coast Artillery and rated as a navigator in July 1940. He continued serving as a navigator in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II, and he was a member of Crew Number 9 on the plane the Whirling Dervish, which was a part of the squadron of Jimmy Doolittle that conducted the raid on Japan following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1942. Following the raid, the crew of Tom's plane was forced to bail out over China mainland. And Tom just recently returned from a trip to China in which he participated in a reunion, of which we're looking forward to hearing more about. Later in the war, Tom served as navigator in North Africa until he was shot down and captured by the Germans in July 1943, and he remained a prisoner of war until his release in April 1945. Decorations that Tom has earned includes the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and the Chinese Army, Navy, and Air Corps Medal, Class A, first grade. Before I turn the program over to Tom, I want to recognize and introduce to you Tom's friend and driver, Vince Spray, which you will see right behind the camera back there. Vince served as top turret gunner on the B-24 during the war. And so say hi to Vince back there before we get started. And now it is my great pleasure and my great privilege to present to you Major Tom Griffin.
Thank you. I'm still trying to figure the best way to do this. I think if I try to stand up, I'll only last about halfway through my talk, so I might as well start sitting down.
Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction. This is a great crowd to tell this to. I know there are a number of old Air Force fellows here. I see Russ Whitty here, who flew B-25s in North Africa, and that's the type of plane that I'm going to be telling you about, that Jimmy Doolittle and the rest of us flew off the carrier on the Doolittle Tokyo raid. Vince has already been introduced. He flew in B-24s out of England against Germany. Now I know I'm missing some of you other men here that were in the Air Force also, but welcome. Glad to be telling you this story. I just got back from China. I got back last Sunday night, and just managed to get my cold that I brought back from China cured about this morning, so I'm feeling pretty good. The Chinese government invited flying tigers and men who flew over the hump, the men that flew over the mountains from India, bringing supplies and personnel into China during World War II, the hump flyers. And as an afterthought, they also invited the Doolittle Raiders. There's 17 of us still alive, but only 2 of us were able to accept their invitation and go over to China. And being in China today is really an eye-opener. That country is just going to town. They have, of course, the Chinese government, but they've turned their industry loose They like the dollars that they bring in, and we were in cities like Beijing, Shanghai. They took us all over. We were there almost 3 weeks, and they wined and dined us and had shows and banquets, and we just had a wonderful time. I don't know really why they chose this time particular to invite veterans from the old World War II, unless they usually have a reason for what they do, and I suppose in some way they figure they're earning some brownie points somehow or other. In 2008, they're going to have the Olympics there, and you can tell from some of the work that they're doing that they're getting prepared for that. The big cities in China are just boom cities today. Skyscrapers going up all over the place. The country is just in a remarkable time of economy and prosperity over there. Now, having said that about China and my trip there, I'll get you way back in history to the springtime of 1942, when things in China were very, very much different. The President Roosevelt, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, told his military advisors that they had to figure some way to strike Japan right up just as soon as they possibly could. And that was the reason that Jimmy Doolittle, 4 months later, managed to lead a group of B-25 twin-engine Mitchell bombers off the deck of a carrier and bomb targets in Japan. It was an amazing thing, and he was an amazing leader to have trained us and led us on this mission. He just had a total of about 6 weeks to train us on the technique of getting a twin-engine Army bomber off the deck of a carrier. And because he was a great leader and a great aviator, he succeeded in getting all of us ready for this very unusual mission. Just a little bit more on Jimmy Doolittle. He got his wings in the old Army Air Force in 1919, just too late to get in World War I. And the Air Force apparently saw something special in him because they sent him to MIT in about 1921, and he received one of the first degrees in aeronautical engineering from MIT. Then in the 1920s, he succeeded in setting many flying records, long-distance flying records, and he did things like flying on instruments for the first time, taking off and landing on instruments. One of the great pioneer aviators of aviation, a remarkable man. In the early 30s, he got out of the Air Force and went to work for Shell Oil, and they sent him around the world as a goodwill ambassador, and it was a wonderful education for Jimmy Doolittle because he saw what the Japanese were doing in aviation, which were in violation, and Germany also, what the Luftwaffe was doing, in violation of the Geneva Convention for the building of aviation. Of course, America was following the rules strictly, and we practically had no Army or Air Corps during those 20s and 30s because they were following the rules strictly, and I'm going to get a hold of that glass of water there so I have it to drink when my mouth. Thank you very much. Maybe I could hold this here, or I'll put it on the floor. That's a very good boy. So the Navy, or the armed forces, the leaders of the armed forces, were hard-pressed to try to figure a way to satisfy President Roosevelt and to strike Japan in those early days of the war. We didn't have airfields close enough for the planes of those days to fly to Japan and back. And so it wasn't until about a month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that a naval officer was down at Norfolk, Virginia, and he saw an experiment being done there where two B-25 Mitchell bombers, the new twin-engine bombers that were just coming out, were put on the deck of a carrier, and the carrier sailed out off of Norfolk, and these two bombers took off. So he went back to Washington and with the idea, why not put a whole squadron of those long-range new Army bombers on the deck of a carrier and sail the carrier over off of Japan and have them take off and bomb targets in Japan. Now they couldn't possibly land back on a carrier, so they were going to have enough gas to get them onto China, our closest ally in that part of the world, after they bombed Japan. The head of the Navy thought that this was a good idea, and they handed the idea to Hap Arnold, who was in command of the Army Air Force, and he had on his staff at that time Major Jimmy Doolittle, one of the finest men he could have had to give this problem to. And Doolittle said he would study the thing to see if it was at all practical. He came back 2 days later, and he said the only aircraft he could possibly get off the deck of a carrier would be this B-25 Mitchell bomber. And it just happened that the only group in the Air Force at that time that was getting these new bombers was the group I was in up in the McCord Field, Washington. All during 1941, we had been receiving these new B-25s, replacing our old B-18s and B-23s. And at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, we were fully equipped with the new B-25 Mitchell bomber. So, in as much as it was the only plane that could possibly fit and get off of a aircraft carrier, Doolittle came to our group and asked for crews to fly on this very secret mission that he was going to train us for and he was going to lead us on. We had been, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, we had been flying off of the Washington and Oregon coast for those weeks immediately after December the 7th, looking for whatever might show up there. Of course, our country, and particularly our people on the West Coast, were afraid that the Japanese, after hitting Pearl Harbor, would continue on and strike targets on the West Coast. But as we learned later, after searching out over the ocean for a number of weeks, the Japanese had no intention at that time. They had totally crippled our Pacific fleet, all but the aircraft carriers, and they were content then to go on to other victories in the Pacific. So after about 6 weeks of very frustrating searches out for Japanese, which weren't there, we suddenly got orders in our group to fly to Columbia, South Carolina. And when we got down to Columbia, South Carolina, they asked for volunteers for a mission that had unusual elements of danger in it, and they wanted to tell people that it was going to be a very dangerous mission, and they wanted them to volunteer under those circumstances. And as far as I can remember, our whole group volunteered. After all, we had just been at war now about 6 or 8 weeks, and we figured that there were going to be dangerous missions ahead. So they sent 20 crews of us down to Eglin Field, Florida. And when we got down there, Jimmy Doolittle showed up. And he emphasized first to us that what we were going to train for and go and do on this mission had to be very secret, because if our enemy knew or got a hint in any way of what we were planning on doing, our whole mission would be a failure. We wouldn't be able to reach Japan. So the first thing we were told to do would be to write our people and tell them that we were going to be gone for 2 months, and we let them know when we got back in the country. Then for the next 6 weeks, Doolittle put the boys through all kinds of strenuous training there at Eglin Field, Florida. And of course, the most unusual part of their training was to get these B-25 bombers up in as short a distance as possible, which amounted to something like 400 to 500 feet. Now, the minimum time to get a B-25 up, according to the book, was about 1,500 feet. So the boys had to learn to just horse these planes up in the air and try to get them airborne in 500 feet. Now, these planes were empty in as much as they didn't have a bomb load or a heavy gas load. But the difference of that and when we were on the carrier later was going to be the tremendous wind and the speed of the carrier into the wind that got us airborne much more heavily loaded. We trained down there at Eglin Field until about the 3rd week of March, when we all flew out to Sacramento, California, which was a maintenance base. They went over our engines and leaned on our carburetors and did things like that for about a week there. In February, another fellow and I had an interesting assignment from Doolittle. He sent us up to Washington, D.C. to work with Air Force intelligence. And we were to get together all of the maps of Japan and of China that 20 crews were going to need, and also the information, all the information that we could get from Air Force intelligence on the exact locations of military and industrial targets that we could use in the Japanese islands. And we spent about a week getting all of these things together, and then we crated all that up and took it back down with us to Eglin Field. This was such a secret mission that the Air Force intelligence, men that we worked with, were told to just cooperate with us and get what we asked for and not to ask any questions. So we got all that together, and in the 3rd week of March, we took off from Eglin Field, Florida, and flew out to Sacramento, California. We got our planes, our motors all, our engines all gone over. New props were put on our planes. And on the first day of April, we flew over to the Alameda Naval Air Station in San Francisco Bay. And our newest carrier, the Hornet, had just docked there the day before. It had gone from Norfolk down to the Panama Canal and got up to San Francisco just at the time that we were finishing our training. And we landed there at Alameda. We landed 20 planes, and the Navy told Doolittle at that time that they could not accommodate 20 planes on the deck of the carrier. They could only accommodate 16. And it was interesting how he solved that problem. He stood at the end of the runway, and as each plane landed, he shouted up to the pilot, how's everything with your plane? And if the pilot said, everything's fine, why, taxi over this way, and a big crane picked him up and put him on the deck of a carrier. But if a man said, well, my left engine's a little rough, anything other than the plane was perfect, he eliminated 4 planes. Those boys didn't know the importance of that question. However, we had 4 crews then that would be back in the States if we left them there. So Doolittle had those 4 crews go across the Pacific with us for security reasons as much as anything. But it turned out that they were a good labor pool to dip into to change personnel here and there on some of the other crews. So they came along with us, and they were welcome. The next day, that afternoon, after they got all of our planes loaded on the deck of the Hornet, we thought we were going to sneak out of San Francisco Bay under cover of darkness. The west coast to coast at that time was all blacked out. And so late in the afternoon, we were very delighted when an announcement came over the loudspeaker on the carrier Army flying personnel can go into San Francisco and have the night on the town and be at a certain wharf at 7:30 in the morning. We were very delighted, and I won't get into any details, but we all had a very good time in San Francisco that night. What we didn't know was that, not Hap Arnold, but the big Navy...
Nimitz?
Who?
Nimitz? Nimitz or Halsey?
Halsey.
Okay.
Bull Halsey flew in from Hawaii that night and met with Doolittle in a hotel room in downtown San Francisco. And Halsey was going to be in command of the task force that's going to take us across the Pacific. And they talked over this job. And among other things, Halsey said that he would get the task force within 400 miles of Japan, if it was at all possible to do so. You have to understand that at this time, the Japanese had turned the Pacific Ocean into a Japanese lake. And this task force of ours that was going across the Pacific, deep into Japanese-controlled waters, was going to be a very touchy job. The Japanese, after hitting Pearl Harbor, as you all know, went on to take over places like Wake Island and Guam. They put a large army on the Philippines and were in the process in that springtime of '42 of defeating our forces in the Philippines. And then they drove down into the Dutch East Indies for the rubber and oil they could get there. And they were pretty much dominating that whole part of the world. Probably Australia was going to be next. They seem to be heading that way. So this is the situation that we had. We left San Francisco Bay the next morning under a beautiful sunshiny day with 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. We sailed out under the Golden Gate Bridge. And the Navy personnel didn't like the Doolittle Raiders at all at those first days because we had been imbued with the idea of the secrecy of our mission. And when we got on the carrier, we still wouldn't answer the questions of the sailor boys of what was going on. And so they were very upset with us, and they were under the belief that in all probability their beautiful new carrier was going to be used as a transport ship to take a squadron of Army bombers somewhere, probably to Hawaii. So they were very unhappy with us until we got about an hour out past the Golden Gate Bridge when the loudspeaker, I think maybe Captain Mitchell got far enough out so nobody would jump overboard and swim back to San Francisco. He made the announcement that this task force was going to go to Japan, and the Army boys were going to take off and bomb targets in Japan. And of course, a great cheer went up, and the Navy boys became very good friends with us for the rest of this trip across the Pacific. They even let us get in their poker games, and they proceeded to clean most of us out of our money. Doolittle Raiders, it's a historical fact, most of us were broke when we took off the bomb. We sailed about a week, and we rendezvoused with Halsey. Halsey had the Enterprise, another carrier, and he had 2 more cruisers and 4 destroyers. And he was now in command of the whole task force. Now we headed across the Pacific with two carriers, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. And there were many high-ranked naval officers that were very much opposed to this whole thing because this was just about the main strength we had in the Pacific at that time, and we were going deep into Japanese-controlled waters with this task force. And a lot of Navy brass were very much opposed to this whole idea. Every morning we had briefings in which each one of our 16 crews were assigned specific targets in Japan. 11 of our planes were going to bomb targets in the immediate Tokyo area. And one was going to bomb a naval yard down the southern part of Tokyo Bay. And then we had a plane going to each of cities Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya, and bombing big factories they had there. Those were going to be our assignments. And we got these assignments as we went across the ocean. Now the Navy planes on the Hornet, the carrier that we were on, were all down in the hangar deck. And they couldn't be brought up to be used in case this task force was intercepted by the Japanese. They couldn't be brought up to be used until our planes got off of the carrier deck. And we actually had a couple days when in our briefing, the first thing in the morning, we were told if the task force was intercepted, our planes were going to be just simply thrown overboard because that was the only, we couldn't reach any place of importance, and the Navy planes couldn't come up to help protect the task force until we cleared the flight deck. And that situation prevailed for a couple of days. And then we reached a point where in our morning briefing we were told if the task force was intercepted, we would take off and we would be able to reach Japan and bomb our targets. Now our side was so anxious to get those bombs down in Japan at that time that we would have been out of gas and been prisoners of the Japanese then if that situation prevailed. But of course it didn't. We, on the morning of the 18th, we dropped off of our 8 destroyers because those little smaller ships could not keep up with the 4 cruisers and 2 aircraft carriers. The last 2 days we were going to go full speed all the way to 400 miles from Japan, bomb, and then those 2 carriers and 4 destroyers would turn around. So we dropped off our 8 destroyers, and the cruisers were going to be with us. I think I got that right. But on the, we were going to take off late in the afternoon of April 18th, but on the morning of April 18th, while we were still 650 miles out, we went between Japanese picket ships out there. Now, our Air Force intelligence didn't know that they had ships out that far. So this was a very upsetting thing. Our Navy boys sank those 2 picket ships that our task force went between. And it took about 5 or 10 minutes to get both those ships sunk. Which was time enough for those the radio operators on the Japanese ships to send a message to Japan, the home islands, that this task force was coming. Now the Japanese, doing some fast calculation, knew the range of Navy planes, and so they knew that this task force of ours was going to have to come another 24 hours to get close enough for the Navy planes to reach targets in Japan. Halsey immediately sent word over that we were to take off. So now instead of being 400 miles from Japan, we were 650 miles out when we took off. When we took off, we couldn't quite figure how we were possibly going to get to Japan, bomb our targets, and fly on to a field in China, which was supposed to be ready to receive us. We just weren't going to have enough gas. So that didn't look so good. But the main problem that we had was getting the planes up in the air. Now these planes had a ton of bombs. We had between 300 and 400 extra gallons of gas in rubber tanks that had been installed. A big rubber tank over the bomb bay carried almost 300 gallons extra. And then we had a 90-gallon rubber tank where the bottom turret would have been. So we almost had double the amount of gasoline on each plane that would normally be carried. They took 250 pounds of radio equipment out of our planes, which meant that we couldn't talk between planes in flight, only within each plane. So we were overloaded between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds more than the B-25 was ever supposed to carry on a normal takeoff. And we were going to have to get these planes up in the air at 400 feet. Now, it was very interesting how this was. It just happened that this morning we had heavy seas, which meant that the carrier flight deck was rolling and pitching. But we were going into a wind of around 25 knots, which meant that with the carrier going full speed, about 30 knots into 25 knots of wind, meant that we were taking off into between 50 and 60 knots, so almost a gale force of wind. And that's what gave us the lift we needed in 400 feet to get these heavily laden planes up in the air. Doolittle took the first plane off. Now, it was an interesting exercise. The carrier, of course, had turned into the wind. Each plane was dragged up to a line 400 feet from the bow. Now, the pilot sat there, full throttle, full flaps, full brakes, and on a signal from the flag man, he released the brakes and started rolling down the deck. Now, I believe that it is estimated that we weren't going much more than 50 to 60 miles an hour when we lifted off the deck, just about the time the bow of the carrier had reached its farthest point and was starting down. We reached the bow and we separated there. Every plane got off successfully that way. Fortunately, I was in plane number 9, and I saw 8 planes successfully negotiate that takeoff. So we were very happy in plane number 9 to see what was happening up ahead. Now, by the time plane number 9 was ready to go, we had maybe a couple hundred more yards, a couple hundred more feet to take off. But it didn't work that way. Every one of our planes was dragged up to that same line, 400 feet from the bow. And the reason for that was we only had 6 feet of clearance from our right wingtip to the island. And that gave us 6 feet from our left wheel to the edge of the flight deck. So if on this takeoff you veered right or left 6 feet, your takeoff run was over. And the longer the run you had, the more chance you had of veering one way or another. So every plane was brought up to that same line, 400 feet from the bow, and it worked. We all got off. The only accident in the whole takeoff happened with the 16th plane, and we didn't know about this for some weeks later. The Navy boys would drag the planes up to this line, 400 feet from the bow, and one of them, in dragging the 16th plane up, inadvertently stepped back in the prop and lost his arm. And that's the only accident in the whole takeoff series. On the way in, we flew in right on the deck, 10 or 15 feet off the water, so the Japanese radar wouldn't pick us up. It's very difficult for radar to work with something coming in that low. Now, we were 4 or 5 minutes apart, and because we didn't have the gasoline to form into formation, each plane, after it got airborne, headed into Japan. So we were 4 or 5 minutes apart, which meant that in most cases, we never saw another B-25. In our plane, we never saw another B-25. The only ones that did get together happened to meet. 2 or 3 planes met over Tokyo itself and flew out together. But we all flew in at that distance apart. Doolittle got there and took the Japanese pretty much by surprise. He flew over the city with a plane load of incendiaries and lit up the whole area pretty well. But he got there right around noontime. Instead of getting there right after dark, he got there right at noontime because we had to take off so early. And by the time plane number 9 that I was in got to the northeastern section of Tokyo, we could see where 8 planes had bombed the city ahead of us. Now confused the Japanese more than anything was the fact that they had had an air raid drill in that city that morning, and they had the all clear signals had gone off about 10 minutes before Doolittle's plane appeared over the city. And this thoroughly confused them because the plane looked something like some of the Japanese planes. And here 4 minutes later another came over and bombed it. By the time plane number 9 got there, they were well aware that they were under attack, and they had flak up all over the city. They didn't shoot any of our planes down, but they wasted an awful lot of flak. They even had some flak towers around in Tokyo, where they had the anti-aircraft guns way up high. And because we went in at rooftop level, they had to depress those guns to shoot at us. And some of our people saw their shells exploding in the street. They might have done as much damage to Tokyo as we did that day, shooting those anti-aircraft guns. Our target was a factory in the southern part of the city of Tokyo, right on the bay. And in going over the city itself, our plane went right over Hirohito's house at about 50 feet. And we pulled down to the southern part of the city of Tokyo, and we all pulled up to 1,500 feet to make our bomb run so we wouldn't be subject to the concussion of our own bombs. And we got down the southern part of the city of Tokyo and headed across the bay to bomb this target that we were assigned, which was a factory right on the water in the southern part of the city. And we made our run. We pulled up to 1,500 feet and made our run. And because the pilot and co-pilot navigator couldn't see what the bombs did, we had to take the word of our bombardier and the top turret gunner that we had really flattened this target of ours. And it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years after the war that it was found in the Japanese archives, where they kept a record of where each one of our planes had gone and what we bombed. And plane number 9 did not bomb that tank factory that we were supposed to bomb. We flattened its immediate neighbor, the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company. And this is a typical World War II error. Usually, and this is so true in Europe too, they have a target, and there would go the neighborhood. The bombers today, when you hear what they're doing in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, they pinpoint bombing now. But it wasn't in our days. It was more saturation bombing. And I think that's what brought about the end of the war in Germany and Japan. They didn't have much left of cities by the time our Air Force got through with them. Anyway, I digress. We pulled up to 1,500 feet, dropped our bombs, and then dropped back down to rooftop level and flew out of there. We flew back out directly in an easterly direction for about 50 miles to confuse their defenses and to make them think we were returning to a ship. Then we turned right and we paralleled the Japanese islands for the rest of the afternoon. To give you an idea of how long these flights were with all this extra gas we were carrying, plane number 9, from the time we took off from the carrier at 9 in the morning until we ran out of gas over China and bailed out, we were in the air for 15 and a half hours. So we got a lot of use out of all that extra gasoline. When we left the carrier and well into the day, our calculations, the best calculations we could make, were that we were going to run out of gas about 100 to 150 miles short of China. Well, what happened was this. We got down to the southern tip of the Japanese islands. Now it was getting late in the afternoon, and we turned right for the flight that due west across the China Sea. And we were going to be over the China Sea for between 5 and 6 hours. And this is where we had anticipated in all of our calculations that we would have a westerly wind, a headwind. And when we got into the leg of this part of the flight over the China Sea. We could see the weather disintegrating up ahead. There was a huge storm. And we pulled up and took what we call a wind drift and discovered, to our great delight, that instead of having a headwind, we had a tailwind. And the storm situation out ahead of us gave us a strong tailwind. And this tailwind got all of our planes at least to the China coast before they ran out of gas, instead of ditching in the water. We, in plane number 9, most of the planes had plans, you know, American boys like to have plans what they're going to do. Before we figured this out, that we were possibly going to be able to reach China, we figured we were going to run out of gas. We were going to land, we'd see a ship somewhere when we're real low on gas, and we were going to ditch in the water. And they would take us aboard. And if it was a friendly ship, well, fine, we'd sail off with them. If it was unfriendly, well, we each had a .45 pistol, so we would take the ship over and sail it off. That was our light at the end of the tunnel. But fortunately, with this good wind that we got, we didn't have to do that. Now, we were going into a storm. It was nighttime now, and we pulled up into this storm and just flew directly into, we pulled up to 10,000 feet. Because when we realized we were going to reach the China coast, we knew there were mountains in that part of China that went up as high as 8,000 feet. So we went to 10,000 to clear them. 4 of our planes stayed down in contact with the water and ditched right along the coast. A fellow, Ted Lawson, who wrote the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, was one that did that. Ted got right there to the Chinese coast, and he saw a long, sandy, smooth beach, and he put his wheels down for some reason. I'm not too sure. He was just about out of gas, and I think maybe he figured he was going to taxi to a gas station someplace. But he put his wheels down, and as he dragged the plane in, they caught the whitecaps and they tumbled the plane in. And those fellas all lived, but they're all bunged up. And the story, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, some of you may have read it. Gangrene set in on a bad cut in his leg. And a doctor that we had in our outfit took his leg off. That's roughly the story. The doctor, incidentally, was an interesting case. He was a flight surgeon that went to Doolittle down at Eglin Field and said he thought that Doolittle should carry a doctor in one of the crews. And Doolittle said, well, if you will qualify as an aerial gunner, I'll put you on one of the crews. And by coincidence, he was on a crew that ditched in the water about 4 miles from where Ted Lawson had his problems. And in the ensuing days, when the Chinese realized he was a doctor, they got him together with that crew. And he took care of them and was the one responsible for taking Ted's leg off. But I digress a little bit. 11 of us, 11 planes opted to pull up into this storm and to fly till we ran out of gas. Now we got to 10,000 feet to clear all the mountains. Most of the people ran out of gas right along in that province south of Shanghai, that area right in there. And that province was occupied by the Japanese. And the result of that was they did capture 8 of our people. And the Chinese, when they realized who we were and what we had done, got all the rest of our people out of Japanese-occupied China into free China. And they did this at a terrible cost to their lives, because about a month after our raid, the Japanese drove down through that area, and it is estimated that they killed 200,000 Chinese. Any villages or any peoples that helped the Doolittle raiders get away to freedom were put to death. They really paid an awful price for their cooperation with us and for helping us. And incidentally, I digress more. When I was in in China recently on one of the banquets. I had an opportunity to talk at this banquet, and I had an opportunity to thank the people of China, particularly that part of China, for having saved the lives of so many of the Doolittle raiders and had paid such a terrible price for us. So I did get an opportunity to do this on the recent trip to China. 55 men bailed out of 11 planes that night in a storm. Now, they all had similar experiences to the one that I had, so I'll tell you what it's like if you bail out at 10,000 feet in the midst of a big storm, and it is quite an experience. We ran out of gas. We were ready for the last hour. We knew we couldn't let down because there were mountains below us. It was nighttime. We could hardly see our wingtips. So our engines quit and we bailed out. Now I'll tell you how it felt. I was suddenly in a black void. You couldn't see a thing. And I had no feeling of falling. But I could just barely see my chute. And it would go way over here to one side and it would fold up. And I think, well, I'm losing all my air. And then it would fill up, go overhead, and it would go to the other side and collapse over here. And it kept doing. I had no feeling of moving. But what I was in a huge pendulum caused by these violent currents that you get in a big storm like that. And gradually, over a period of time, the violent currents abated as I got closer to the earth, and my chute settled overhead. Now, I still couldn't see a thing but my chute. And suddenly, a branch of a tree hit my face, and the next second, I was standing on the ground. My shroud lines just allowed me to reach the ground. Now, this didn't happen with a lot of the other boys. They were hung up in trees and hung up in cliffs. See, 55 men bailed out under the same circumstances. One of them was killed, and about 6 or 7 of them had broken bones, non-death-threatening injuries. Now, I had the good fortune of being able to just reach the ground. My shroud lines let me reach the ground, and I tried to pull the chute out of the tree, and I couldn't get it to move, so I just unbuckled my belt and walked away. And left all that beautiful silk up there in that tree for some Chinese lady to have her man go up and get. I imagine they had a lot of things made out of those parachutes of ours. The Japanese captured 8 of our men. They took them back to Japan and they tried them and the court decided they were not prisoners of war, they were war criminals and they were to be put to death. And Hirohito actually intervened. And you have to know the Oriental mind. He said, shoot these 3 and put the others in prison for life under special harsh treatment. And that's what they did. They took them back to Shanghai and they shot the 3 boys and killed them. And of the 5 boys then that went into prison, at the end of the war, 4 of them were still alive. 1 died. 4 were still alive and came home. And they had a remarkable story. They were in solitary confinement most of the time. And there's a book entitled 4 Came Home, which tells their story. The rest of us, over a period of days and weeks, got out of that part of China occupied and under the thumb of the Japanese into free China. And over a period of weeks, we worked our way back and we finally got to Chongqing, which was the headquarters city of the Chinese. And I had the good fortune once of even having lunch with Madame Chiang. Several of us were invited out to her home there in Chongqing, and we had lunch with Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She spoke much better English than we did, of course. She went to a girls' finishing school in the East, and she's a very charming lady. And after lunch, we went out. We went to the living room of their home, and Chiang Kai-shek pinned medals on us there. And it was a very enjoyable enjoyable day. I went back in 1982. The communists actually invited some raiders back there, and about 8 of us went back. And when we got to Chongqing, they said, well, what do you want to see in this city? And I said, I'd like to go back out to where Chiang Kai-shek had his home, because I have a camera now and I didn't have one then. I'll take some pictures. And they got their heads together and they came back and said, well, you can't go there now. It's a girls' school and it's 14 miles out of town. Well, you know, the Chinese communists that were ruling ran Chiang Kai-shek out of China and sent him to Formosa. So they didn't think too kindly of him. Over a period of weeks, we left 4 crews there with the newly formed 14th Air Force in China. The rest of us flew over the hump into India, and we left about 3 crews with the 10th Air Force in India. We never flew together as a group. And the rest of us, 30-some of us, flew back to the States. In effect, we went completely around the world to do this raid. We bombed Tokyo, went through China, India, across Africa to South America, and then up in a period of about 3 months, and we were back. The raid itself, to sum up what happened, this was the first good news that the American people had had in the war. All the news up to this time was bad news. So it was a great shot in the arm for the American people and their allies. And of course, it had the opposite effect on the Japanese. The Japanese had been told that they didn't have anything to worry about, because enemy planes could never break through their defenses to bomb targets. And here, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, American planes were overhead in the middle of a nice sunny day, bombing them. So that caused them to doubt their leaders a bit for the first time. And the Japanese, not knowing if they're going to have to put up with these nuisance raids anymore, brought back naval and air units to beef up the defenses of Japan. All this caused by our little 16-plane raid. But it had a bigger effect. The biggest effect was this. Yamamoto, who was the head of the Japanese Navy, had been arguing in the high councils of Japan that they were doing the wrong thing at that particular time. They were wrapping up the fighting down in the Dutch East Indies and heading for Australia. He said, we've got to go across the Pacific, entice whatever is left of the American fleet out of Pearl Harbor and sink it, and open up the west coast of America to attack. This is what Yamamoto wanted to do. And he had not been getting anywhere with this argument in the high councils of Japan until the little Doolittle raid. And that changed the whole thing. 2 days after our raid, he got the green light to do what he wanted to do. And he got together that great fleet with four carriers. And he had battleships and cruisers and troop carriers. And 6 weeks after our raid, he was ready to take over his first objective as he came across the Pacific, the little island of Midway. And you all know what happened at Midway. Our people had broken the Japanese code, our Navy people knew that Yamamoto was coming with this fleet. And the Navy put our 2 carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, and the 3rd carrier, the Yorktown, put those 3 carriers and had them sitting about 200, 250 miles up north of Midway. And when the Japanese struck Midway, you all know what happened. The American boys flew down there and sunk all 4 of the Japanese carriers and sent the Japanese back in the first great defeat of the war. The Japanese lost 4 carriers. This battle of Midway gave America, you might say, a year to turn up all of our great production capacity and turn out the aircraft and the aircraft carriers and all the other equipment of war, and train the millions of people that were getting into our armed forces. It was a tremendous victory, Midway was, And it put the Japanese from that time on, when you analyze the Pacific War, it lasted another 3.5 years. But the Japanese were roughly on the defensive instead of the offensive ever after Midway. So that was a tremendous turning point in the war. And of course, we Doolittle Raiders have built up our little raid until we're the ones that were responsible for all that. At any rate, I pretty well covered the Doolittle Tokyo raid. If you have anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer them. If I've left anything out, I can't imagine me leaving anything out. Yes, Vince?
Tell about your tail guns on your B-25s.
Tail guns? Oh, that was another thing that
Yeah,
Doolittle
yeah.
did, the foresight. The B-25 Mitchell bomber that we had was the B-25B, and they didn't have provisions for tail guns. Russ, did you have tail gunners on your B-25s?
No, we didn't.
No. Doolittle had broomsticks cut off and painted black, and we each had 2 broomsticks protruding from the tail section of our plane. And it worked. Nobody was shot down. The Japanese pursuits over Tokyo didn't fly up our tail end, with those 2 broomsticks. That was another little touch of genius. Well, that's the story of the Doolittle Tokyo raid. If there's any questions, yes, sir.
What was the normal range of the B-25? What was the bomb load normally?
The bomb loads, we had a ton of bombs. That was going to be that's about a normal. We had 4 500-pound demolition bombs. A couple of the planes had some incendiaries and demolition, depending on your specific target. And
What was the normal range of that plane without all the extra fuel?
oh, about half of the distance and time that we flew would have been a long flight. Our plane was in the air for 15.5 hours. If you got one of those to fly for 8 hours, you were in a long flight with the B-25. We about double the capacity.
So the speed on that then was what?
Well, the most economical settings had us mushing along most of the day at about 160, 170 miles an hour. You could go a lot faster than that. But that was the most economical fuel setting. Yes, ma'am.
What did you do after the raid?
Oh, I was one of the ones that came back to this country. And I got in with B-25, the B-26 Marauders outfit. That's a twin-engine bomber, too. We were training down in Louisiana. And in late October, we flew across the Atlantic. We flew the northern route, Greenland, Iceland to England. And in November, with the invasion of North Africa, Doolittle was a lieutenant colonel when he led us on that flight. When he got back to the States, he was promoted over full colonel. He was never a full, they made him general. And they put him in command of the 12th Air Force. And the 12th Air Force is the Air Force that went in on the invasion of North Africa in November of '42. And some of us were flying for him down there. There were 5 of us in my group that in B-26s. And that was in November of '42. And by July of '43, of the 5, 2 had been shot, had been killed, and the other 3 of us were in a German prison camp. So we didn't last too long. We were short of experience. Anybody else with questions?
Tell
Yes,
them
ma'am.
about your reunions and tell them about your reunions and your mugs.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've had a reunion. When we were in Chongqing, Doolittle said, when this war is over, I'm going to throw a huge party for you boys someplace. And when the war ended, he had us all down to Miami, Florida, in Bernard McFadden's old hotel there on Miami Beach. And we have a reunion every year. And for the first 10 years or so, it was all men. all of the Doolittle Raiders themselves. And those were very memorable reunions. And but about the end of the 10th year, Josephine Doolittle, Mrs. Doolittle, said from now on, the wives are going to go to these reunions. And the whole tenor changed. We had very wonderful, placid reunions ever since. But we had a reunion in every city, in different cities. Last year we were at Mystic, Connecticut, and this year that's coming up, it's always in April, the reunion, the date of our raid on Tokyo is covered. And we're going to be up in Dayton again. This will be the second time. About 10 years ago we were there. And we're going to be at the Air Force Museum next April for our 63rd reunion.
How many of you are left?
17. 17 of the 80 men are still alive. And it's a peculiar thing, only the hard nuts are left. About 3 years ago, 5 men died. This was the normal attrition. In the last 2 years, nobody has died. Now I'm looking around at these other 16 guys to see who's got. We got a bottle of cognac that's been sitting there with all of our cups. And the last 2 men are going to open that bottle of cognac and have the final toast to the departed comrades. So I'm looking over the other 16 to see who's going to open up that bottle of cognac.
Did you ever fly back in Asia again? Or did you finish out the war in the German prison camp?
German prison camp, yeah. We were standing by in the summer of '45 thinking we might have to invade Japan, and the atom bombs ended it, so that was that. Thank goodness. Folks, you've just heard the story, badly told by Doolittle Raider.
Thanks, Tom. What a privilege it's been for you to share your story with us, and do know how much you are appreciated for who you are and for the contributions that you've made in your service to our nation. And before I turn the program back to our President, Caroline, I'd like to announce the guest speaker for the next Supper Club event, which will be October the 24th, and the speaker will be Staff Sergeant Paul Braunhaber. Paul gives an inspirational message which comes from the heart. He's a native Cincinnatian, a member of the First Baptist Church of Glen Estee, and among other accomplishments, Paul served with the 216th Combat Engineer Unit and the 1st Infantry Division in Operation Iraqi Freedom. His tour ended early when his combat patrol was attacked with small arms fire and a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded near his Humvee in Sabara, north of Baghdad. And Paul credits the Lord, his prayers, the soldiers around him, his military and American Red Cross training with the saving of his life. Paul has received numerous military awards. He now resides in Cincinnati with his wife and 3 children. And when not serving in the Army National Guard, he works full-time for Cincinnati Recreation Commission and teaches school part-time. He was pretty badly injured, but Staff Sergeant Braunhaber feels that it's been and is a true honor to serve his community, state, and his country, the United States of America. Now, you're not going to want to miss this inspirational message that Paul has to share with you. Okay. Thank you, and Caroline.
Be the tie that binds, and then Pastor Jewett's in the back, and he'll give us our closing prayer. Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love, the fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the wonderful inspiration of this evening. to stir up our memories, the memories of many of us, and inspire us with thoughts of heroism and self-sacrifice that we can carry with us and be moved to think along those same lines even today. We thank you for men and women, Father, who gave of themselves during that war and all the wars since then. And we thank you for protecting and blessing our country, and ask that you would continue to do that as your people repent and turn to you and call upon your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.